Module 7, which is the kind of the summation of this training. And so now we've been through 7 modules for the impact of ACEs and toxic stress on Indigenous communities. And so this is kind of an overview or a summary of the things that we have been talking about. This is a supplemental training that has been approved and certified by the ACEs Aware initiative. And it also encouraged people to participate in the core ACEs Aware training as well. So as we begin this module, the training learning objectives that participants will be able to define adverse childhood experiences, define how providing trauma-informed care for Indigenous communities of California must include an understanding of their histories and how these experiences relate to intergenerational transmission of adversity and protective factors from an Indigenous perspective, and describe how the content of these modules support screening for ACEs and treatment of toxic stress in Indigenous communities. And so part of review is asking this question, what are ACEs? And so this is all information that we've gone over before, but it's just to kind of put it into one place. And so we know that ACEs, that there's 10 categories of ACEs, that there's the abuse, which can be physical, emotional, or sexual. There's the neglect, which is physical or emotional. We know that there's the household challenges, which was originally phrased as household dysfunction, but that was reframed by the CDC. That growing up in a household with parental incarceration, mental illness, substance dependence, absence due to separation or divorce, intimate partner violence, these are all examples of household challenges. We also talked about the prevalence of ACEs among Indigenous peoples, and we noted that nationally, Native Americans reported the higher rates of ACEs of any other local and ethnic group. We also noted that locally in Hoopa, California, that 31.4% of Indigenous peoples had an ACE score of 4 or more. We compared this to the rest of the state of California, and even among the highest numbers, which is 17.3% in Latina communities, that the Hoopa community is almost double in looking at the prevalence of ACEs. We also talked about health inequities among Indigenous peoples. We identified that diabetes incidences is 177% times higher, with the highest rate of type 2 diabetes. We identified that tuberculosis incidences is 500% times higher. We also talked about Native teens experiencing the highest rate of suicide of any other population, 10 times the national norm. And we talked about violence accounts for 75% of deaths among youth ages 12 to 20. And so this is pulling all of these things together that we've been talking about. And so we also answered the question, what is intergenerational transmission of adversity? So not only looking at ACE scores and other social determinants of health, but also looking at the intergenerational trauma and intergenerational transmission of adversity. And we learned that intergenerational transmission of toxic stress occurs when adverse experiences alter parental biology or behavior in ways that affect the development and health of their children. That parenting behaviors, positive experiences, societal factors, and historical traumas also influence how health risks are passed from parent to child. And we talked about how does this relate to Indigenous communities? And in one of the modules, we discussed the local history of California and not being able to mourn the loss during these periods of genocide, the abuse and neglect in boarding schools, the forced removal from homelands, the slavery and concubinage, in combination with ongoing oppression, racism, and discrimination are all impacts of intergenerational transmission of adversity. But even despite these high ACE scores, and despite the social determinants of health, things such as racism, discrimination, structural racism as well, separation from parents, poverty, and in addition to the intergenerational trauma and then the intergenerational transmission of adversity, that even despite all of these things, it does not mean that a person is destined to have health disparities, that we can interrupt toxic stress, and we can lengthen the telomeres that protect chromosomes of our bodies. And we can do this through protective factors. And protective factors are intrinsic or extrinsic conditions or attributes that mitigate risk for toxic stress. And so from a ACEs aware perspective, some of these intrinsic factors include the neurologic, endocrine, metabolic, immune, genetic, and epigenetic factors, curiosity and learning, ability to pay attention, ability to regulate emotion. In extrinsic factors, buffering relationships, supporting environment, community resources. We talked about protective factors from Indigenous perspective, and we heard testimonials from people who have utilized these protective factors as tools for resilience. We've also noted in this intergenerational strength, that although we do have intergenerational transmission of adversity that can have impacts on toxic stress, that we also have these resilience tools, strength of Indigenous peoples that that have always been there, and as Dr. Perry says, even in unhealthy communities, that we can reweave that social fabric for healthy lifestyles. And so some initial steps for professionals, one is to screen for ACEs. Screening for ACEs is an important step in this. Two is to be aware of our own explicit and implicit bias. We talked about explicit and implicit bias in module 3, and then again at the beginning of module 6, is that each person has bias. It's a part of human nature, and it's important to be aware of how our bias influences our interpretations, expectations, and assumptions of our clients. Acknowledging that Indigenous peoples are more than a boat, more than their diagnosis, more than the statistics. There's more to Indigenous peoples than sometimes what we are conditioned to know about Indigenous peoples, which also is looking at the need for testimonial justice, nurturing spaces for Indigenous peoples to speak for themselves, to identify their needs. Another important step is shifting the paradigm of institutional frameworks. And we spoke of that there can be multiple ways of doing things, that sometimes institutional frameworks have policies, have programs, systems in place of how things have to be, focusing on one truth, on one lens. But sometimes in shifting the paradigm of the institutional framework into a more multi-logical lens can actually nurture space for people to feel connected and a part of that program. And finally, acknowledge that there are activities to prevent, treat, and disrupt the intergenerational transmission of toxic stress within Indigenous communities. So it isn't a hopeless ending, that there are activities to prevent, treat, and disrupt the intergenerational transmission of toxic stress within Indigenous communities. And so I'd like to close with a clip from our young people and a message, testimony that they have also would like to share.
I love my culture because I can make cool things like this rock house. Inside, not that much, but that's one of the reasons why I love being Yurok. Kind of like how I love smoked salmon. It's delicious!
I love the food because there are some of my favorite foods that our culture has created, which are fry bread, salmon, and acorn. And then the land is beautiful. Some of the land is rivers and like up in the mountains and different places like that. And some of the places are where we hold our ceremonies.
The Yurok culture and many other cultures around here are resilient. When miners came looking for gold a long time ago and tried to annihilate the Native Americans of this area, it didn't happen. The Yurok people also had very sophisticated ways of building, storing food, and living in general.
And what I love about being Yurok is that I get to learn new things. And I get to learn about what new foods there are.
The traditional dances and praying for other people.
I love being Yurok because I can hear stories from my family, like my grandma, my dad, and my mom, my brother.
What I like about being Indigenous, I get to participate in the ceremonies. I get to eat Repoy, kaka, all these different kinds of fish, and kitwin, which is eel. And I like when I get to go to the dances and I get to dance in it too.
I liked the way that they were so handsome and tweeted that had beautiful parrots, so I want beautiful parrots, so I just see him.
I like learning to be a storyteller with my dad and telling stories with my dad.
I take care of the baskets, the future, and the offlodge in the basket, and the ceremonies. I like helping elders by bringing the fish and salmon because that's what it is to take care of them. And I like brush dances because people make dresses for other people because they love their, because they like the brush dances that they do.
And how does it make you feel?
Happy. What it makes me feel like is when I crack the acorn is happy and so grateful for my mom and taking care of the acorns.
I like to help my dad teach about the Yurok culture and say true stuff.
It makes me feel happy, and I enjoy going to the ceremonies and learning more from my elders.
I feel good about it because the brush dances and the dances are like in my blood. It's what we Indigenous people do. It's in our blood.
Really excited.
And I feel really good about being Yurok.
Well, thank you for joining us. We're finished with all 7 modules, Chem-Tem, impacts of ACEs and toxic stress on Indigenous communities. And so thank you. Thank you for